In most instances, for a general do-it-yourself project, you're probably going to be able to get away with using insulation for all of your draft stop. And it might already be done as part of your exterior envelope. When you insulate your exterior walls or your floor system, you could already take care of the bulk of fire blocking or draft stopping requirements. But it's important to at least understand where it's required and kind of what the purpose is. Fire blocking is just that, right? It's to protect the movement of fire up through interior, like concealed spaces. So if you have like wrapped ductwork, if you have stud bays, studs that are pulled off the wall, and you have like a dead space back there, so if a fire started, it could travel really fast down through that concealed space, right? If you have like dropped ceilings, okay, maybe you've got, maybe you have like a 10-foot high ceiling, but in the bathrooms, they framed a ceiling down lower than that. So you actually have like this dead space up there. That'd be like a concealed space. And if a fire was ever to start in a stud bay and go up and get into that space, it could travel a lot faster. So fire blocking is just that. It's to try to stop the movement it's the block fire moving up and through concealed spaces. Draft stopping, you're not going to run into this a lot, I don't believe, in a house. They're just talking about spaces that are over 1,000 square feet, a concealed space, and they want to make sure they don't go over 1,000. So, and they want it to be split equally. So if you had a big rec room and you had like a suspended T-bar ceiling, some type of suspended ceiling, and so now you have this dead space up in there, and it's over 1,000 feet, well, then you might need to put a wall in there, right? And it doesn't have to be anything specific. It's just to break up the movement of draft. So it could be any type of framing members, put up like OSB, put up plywood, put up drywall, seal it, make sure that there's no penetration movement of draft in there, right? Maybe you have open web floor joists. I don't see those ever where I'm at. Everybody uses solid member framing, 2x10s, 2x12s. But maybe you've got some type of engineered floor that's more of like a web-based situation. Well, now that whole floor system is open, right? Everything can kind of breathe through there. So at some point, you're going to end up having to go in and like drywall or sheath one of those or two of those, or however big the space is, one side of that floor joist, that webbed floor joist, because now you're breaking up the spaces. If you have a situation like that, just keep that in mind. When you get called for your framing inspection or whatever, they're gonna, they'll probably tell you. But I want you to know about it ahead of time, right? So you don't end up running all your pipes and your electrical wires or something, and then be like, now I got to go piece in drywall or sheathing. It's a lot easier to drill a hole and run your wire through than it is to piece it in after the fact. Back to fire blocking, right? So fire blocking, same concept. It's breaking up that movement of fire through a stud bay and through maybe like some type of chase. In a house, a lot of times it's wrapping ductwork, right? You frame in that ductwork so you can dry it in, or drywall it in, so you don't have to look at it. And you've created this situation where a stud bay is now communicating with a soffit, right? Some type of vertical to horizontal movement. So if a fire was to get in that stud, it would go up and it could travel down along that ductwork really fast, right? And they want to stop that. They want to protect it. And so I'm going to read a little bit out of code, and I'll show you a few pictures. It's just good to know and a good understanding to think about. Most people use insulation, and well, we're in framing stage. We haven't even got to insulation. So if you're in framing stage and like I got a few soffits I'm going to frame in, but I'll deal with that later. Just know you can do it with insulation, and here I'll kind of show you where and how, but not the end of the world. I just want to make sure you know about it. Here we have fire blocking right here. Fire blocking in combustible construction, so any wood type framing, fire blocking shall be provided to cut off both vertical and horizontal concealed draft openings and to form an effective fire barrier between stories and between the top story and the roof space. fire blocking shall be provided in wood frame construction in the following locations. So fire blocking shall be provided in wood frame construction. It says in concealed spaces of stud walls and partitions, in furred spaces and parallel rows in the following: vertically at the ceiling and roof levels, and horizontally at intervals not exceeding 10 feet. Okay, so what does that mean? Let's go over to a picture here. Okay, so if you take a look at this, if this is over 10 feet, okay, they're going to want, and see how there's a space right here. Let's just pretend that this wall is framed out farther. You put your insulation in there, and there's still an airspace between this foundation wall and the insulation that you put in this, right? You would have communication to flow down between those two spaces, and you have this concealed space. So what they're telling you is every 10 feet you would need to insulate all the way back to here, right? All the way back to the foundation, so that you're breaking that space up. Most of the time, people are going to fill that cavity all the way with insulation. So it's a non-issue, right? It's not really that big a deal. And then they talk about, well, okay, now what about this little space right up here, right? Where this wall and this wall meet, right? You're going to have this space where you don't want to communicate up into the floor joist. So you'd have to insulate this little gap. Well, again, back to just kind of standard insulation practices, you're going to, or energy, you're going to insulate this whole stud bay, and normally it's going to fill the cavity, and you're also going to insulate all the way out, because this is living space above. You're going to insulate this floor joist. So you've already done it. You've already met that requirement. But if there is an instance where maybe you just insulated to right here, and you just insulated to here, and your building department allows it, they might tell you to go in and fire block with insulation, which is just fill that gap, or every 10 feet, just make sure that you fill between the stud and the foundation wall with some more insulation. It's just breaking it up, so if a fire starts in this section, it can't travel to that section or travel up into the floor system. Try not to confuse you, but just make you aware of fire blocking, right? So when you have a little bit, your extra, when you get into insulation, leave all your little extra pieces in case your building inspector says, hey, you missed some fire blocking here. You can just put it up in there and you should be good to go. So it says, this is probably the biggest one that I see in my area, is at interconnections between concealed vertical and horizontal spaces such as occur at soffits, drop ceilings, and cove ceilings. They talk a little bit about stair stringers, obviously pipes and ducts, chimneys and fireplaces. I mean, you're just going to want to make sure that if you have a duct or something, or a pipe that goes from floor to floor, usually guys go in with some foam and they spray around it and they seal it, right? So that smoke or fire can't travel up through that hole that you cut for your pipe. It gets filled, right, with foam or something, that insulation, it gets stuffed, or maybe it gets sheeted or something, some solid blocking, so that you're able to protect against fire movement. But this interconnections between concealed vertical spaces really does happen a lot with soffits, especially if you're finishing your basement. And so that would look something like this, okay? So here you've got a wall, and you've got these stud bays, and here you've got this built up soffit to cover this duct. Well, right here you can see where this stud wall communicates with the soffit, right? So if a fire started here, travel up through the bay, and it could travel up into these floors, and boom, no time flat, the whole thing's on fire. So they want to stop that. They want to make sure if something starts down here, that it gets blocked, fire blocked. So you can use a few different methods. You could just put blocking in there, right? You want to block it right here at the break point between the two. You could do a solid panel. So before you put this ductwork on, you could go in and pre-sheet the wall, and then frame up, put your duct in and frame up your soffit, because you've separated that communication, right? But most people just will insulate this. It's easy to do. You usually have leftovers. What does that look like? It might look something like this. So they have a soffit up in here. They got this duct, and they just went in there and added insulation, right? They've separated the soffit from this wall space. It's Pretty simple. Not the end of the world. The requirement is 16 inches minimum. Okay, so make sure you carry it 16 inches. So what kind of other materials are allowed? So it says 2 thicknesses of 1 inch nominal lumber or with broken lap joints. It says 23-30 seconds wood structural panel, 1 thickness of 3/4 inch particle board with joints backed at 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch gypsum board, so you can just use 1/2 inch drywall, 1/4 inch cement based millboard, and then here's the big one, right? Bats or blankets of mineral wool or glass fiber or other approved materials installed in such a manner as to securely retain the space. Cellulose insulation installed and tested in accordance with the STM. So here they're talking about bats. So bat or blanket or mineral wool, glass fiber or approved non-rigid. So non-rigid, so it has to be a bat material, not a foam board type material, is permitted for compliance with the 10-foot horizontal fire blocking in walls constructed using parallel rows of studs and staggered studs. And then unfaced fiberglass. So here's where they talk about the 16 inches. So unfaced fiberglass bat insulation used for fire blocking shall fill the entire cross section of the wall cavity to a height of not less than 16 inches, right? So it's 16 inches minimum, but you're filling that, you're breaking that soffit from that wall is what you're doing. And then obviously the big one, which is 2-inch nominal lumber, which fire blocking, I'm putting in blocking in there. A lot of people don't do that much anymore. They just use insulation. Draft stopping, I talked about the 1,000 square foot. So concealed space does not exceed 1,000 square foot, right? So draft stops shall be installed in those areas. And here are kind of like the big circumstances where ceiling is suspended under a floor framing, right? So like a T-bar lid, T-bar framing where you have this big space, over 1,000 feet of concealed space up there. You don't want that fire to start up there and travel really fast through that floor system. And then we have floor framing. It is constructed of a truss type open web or perforated members, right? Where you can travel through the actual floor joists and start everything on fire real fast. That really does cover like fire blocking. Like I said, I think for do-it-yourselfers, for the normal home project, you're going to be just fine. Normally, if you insulate everything, you follow your envelope, you might end up with a few situations where your inspector's like, hey, make sure you fire block this or fire block that, or you've got this huge space and they're like, hey, you're going to need to break that up. It's not the end of the world to do it after the fact. That's why I'm not touching on it too in depth. I don't want to confuse you. I think if you just think about soffits, protects wall cavities from soffits, I think you're going to be just fine.